Hello, today is Tuesday, September 26, 2017. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. At TC2, we regularly advise clients who face a difficult choice. Keep my incumbent supplier or migrate services to another provider. Change can be risky, and your incumbent provider knows it, but sometimes it makes sense to make a transition. I'm joined by two of my fellow TC2 project directors, Pat Gilpatrick and Tony Mangino. And on today's podcast, we're going to examine when a supplier transition makes sense. Pat and Tony, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks, Joe. Good to be here with you and Pat.
Okay, Pat, let's start with you. When is it a less difficult decision for an enterprise to at least consider changing service provider?
Well, Joe, every IT organization's mission is to constantly evaluate new technologies, solutions that promise better performance and reliability, hopefully at a lower cost. So if such solution involves a transition to network services, then a migration to a new supplier becomes a lot easier and a stronger internal business case. At TC2 here, we find that there's really greater upper management support for projects that are transformational in nature, where a new networking technology and maybe a new supplier aligns with those initiatives. And it's really quite powerful during an RFP, for instance, when a technology change is in scope, to communicate to incumbents right up front that a migration is inevitable, and as a result, the customer is prepared to transition away from them to achieve those objectives or their project's objectives. It really puts them on notice that their incumbency advantage is minimized, and it really helps pave the way for new players to be strongly considered.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Pat. And I think by way of example, really two most prevalent initiatives we see in the network services space today, talking about transformational technologies, are SIP trunking and increasingly SD-WAN. What we see as the marketplace for both of these technologies is very competitive. And interestingly, the supplier community is much broader than the traditional carriers that you might entertain providing offers for your network services. It's worth noting that we see in our deals at TC2 that the marketplace for SD-WAN continues to really be dynamic and evolve rapidly. With the more traditional telcos, we see acquiring some of these niche solution providers. And really, all of these suppliers are trying to determine the optimal service and solution mix as enterprise customers begin to move away from that legacy traditional MPLS as a primary WAN technology to what is really a hybridized WAN state. The key point, though, really is that deployment of either SIP trunking or SD-WAN is likely to involve new circuit installs and in all likelihood some new equipment. So the key here for this discussion around supplier transition is that the incumbency advantage is mitigated. With SIP trunking, for example, new typically centralized SIP trunks are installed and legacy TDM circuits are disconnected. Then with SD-WAN, in all likelihood, you've got new internet ports, business broadband services are being turned up while those legacy MPLS ports are either downsized or in some cases removed altogether. It's worth mentioning that anytime a new technology is contemplated, that service should absolutely be procured in a competitive leveraged context or an RFP. And in that context, an enterprise customer should expect compelling offers from non-incumbents who are really highly motivated to earn your new business. Some of these new niche suppliers are often more attentive to a new customer, new upside revenue, and you're likely going to get more care and feeding than you would from an incumbent supplier who's really looking at the opportunity not to grow their base of revenue with you, but they're really approaching it from managing a decreasing revenue stream.
So, Tony, besides these transformational initiatives, what else would cause an enterprise to consider switching service providers?
Well, I'd have to say that probably what we hear at TC2 in most all of our customers is dissatisfaction on some level with the current supplier or supplier relationships. And that might extend from account support, service delivery, regional problems with accountability or feet on the street, any number of things.
Absolutely. I agree with Tony. Account support can motivate any enterprise customer to look for alternative solutions. And as he mentioned, with all this increasing price pressure resulting in lower margins, account support staffing has continued to be stretched quite thin. We find dedicated account team resources are really rare these days, even for our largest customers. And service functions that have traditionally been included in the cost, in the monthly service charges or the monthly recurring charges, are now being carved out and dropped into a custom managed service offer that's additional cost or simply charged as a new line item, whether it be resources or servicing of equipment, etc. Often we really highly recommend putting a key personnel clause into your agreement for any long-term agreement, any long-term contract, as that obligates your supplier to keep those negotiated staffing levels and job functions over the term of the entire contract. That's critically important for enforceability purposes to keep the resources that you negotiated so hard for during the RFP. If your resources are staffed adequately, but they're incompetent or they're unresponsive and they're just not giving the support that you require, decisions to put your money where your mouth is and migrate those services become much easier to justify. And in situations like that, it may not be necessary to undertake a wholesale migration to a new supplier, but you could just award new services as they come along or specific circuits to a non-incumbent and get the same kind of result from your legacy supplier.
So I'm sure you guys have seen this. So with our clients, there always seems to be at least one vocal critic of the incumbent service provider. Now, sometimes that criticism, it's really not fact-based, but sometimes they can point to systemic operational issues.
Absolutely right. Regarding the criticism, I don't think we've ever come into enterprise clients that are sitting at the table singing the praises of their suppliers. There's always issues. But one of the easiest ways to justify a migration outside of account support is unacceptable operational performance. So regardless of how carefully you negotiated service levels or how steep the penalties are for service outages, if they simply don't meet your objectives, your running objectives, those suppliers should absolutely be at risk at keeping your business. And that's another reason we negotiate protections around SLI credits as not being a, quote, sole remedy for performance-related issues. That's a very standard position for most suppliers, that they put language in the deal that your only remedy for non-performance is the actual credit, which is never good enough to offset the damage that's been done. If those chronic service level performance issues do arise and it dictates a change, you should absolutely have the right to terminate that service without any liability at a minimum, or potentially terminate the entire contract. Migration to another supplier should be able to happen without any financial penalties or even without impacting your performance toward your contractual commitment levels.
Agreed, Pat. And, it also really seems to come down to the fact that the services that an enterprise buys really at the end of the day need to be cost competitive, not only on day one of your deal, but throughout the term of the agreement. A number of things could happen. The rates that you have for a particular service might be competitive, kind of leading edge of the market at the time of contracting. But depending on the services you're talking about, how rapidly the market is evolving for those particular services, you can find yourself within a year or so starting to fall out of market. The other thing that we see happening a lot is that the needs of the business tend to evolve and change. And so the service mix now, or that your demand requires now, weren't initially contemplated or negotiated with optimized rates. So suppliers who are either unwilling to adjust your rates to keep you competitive with the marketplace or provide competitive rates for those new services to keep pace with the evolving landscape of your business, they really should be in a position to risk losing market share. Further, it's important to have a contract commitment structure which provides this flexibility. At TC2, when advising clients, we're always talking about flexibility and how key that is to managing your overall supplier relationship. You got to have a meaningful rate review or benchmarking clauses which provide an opportunity, a contractual obligation to sit down with your supplier and discuss rate reductions and commitment reductions if those reductions can't be mutually agreed upon. So you need to have a meaningful remedy there. And what that does is helps in holding a supplier accountable for maintaining financial performance. But the key here is, you have to take advantage of them. I can't tell you how many times we come into a deal and we look for some of those key contractual items, your term, your commitment, your rate review, and you say, well, guys, when was the last time you sat down with the supplier and took advantage of the rate review? And everybody around the table looks at each other and they shrug their shoulders and say, well, we didn't have time, or, that kind of fell off the radar screen. Clients should absolutely position themselves with enough contractual flexibility to move services to another supplier if their incumbent is unwilling or unable to maintain price optimization. That's the key. Now, in competitive situations, It often comes down to the cost of change and the real or perceived operational risk of making a supplier change. Incumbents are very keen, right? They know that they don't have to match the leading edge service pricing from a non-incumbent because they can impact the bottom line faster. So what happens is, as a customer, you're looking at the total cost of ownership over a 3-year deal. That incumbent supplier can affect cost reductions on day one with essentially a billing change. What happens is that a non-incumbent isn't able to make that up, and so the incumbent's proposal remains more attractive over the term. Something that incumbents find themselves caught up in, though, is, again, this notion of trying to manage their revenue write-down, and they get caught looking in the rearview mirror at a non-incumbent for whom the opportunity represents new business, and they come after it really aggressively. In these situations, what we often find is senior leadership will often choose to support a migration away from the incumbent because the cost savings are simply too compelling.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony. And Pat, thank you as well. And thank you to the audience for listening. At TC2 and LB3, we support clients through the entire telecom and ICT life cycle, and we have a lot more to say on this topic. So please, check out our website, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, shoot us a message, or give us a call.